Thank you, Phil. I remember hearing a story from one of my mates about his parents. They went on this holiday of a lifetime, and as part of this, you know those holidays where you get to tour, they toured around, they went around to a bunch of countries around the world. And as part of this, they went to India. And they were reflecting on their time in India and about the distinct smells, like the intoxicating smells and aromas as they went down through the marketplaces, yeah? Or the beautiful landscapes as they toured around, or the human sardines as they went through all the different places they were around. But they remembered one thing that stood out above. And for anyone who's visited India, there's one tourist destination that you've got to visit. It's one place that everyone has to go to, and that place would be the Taj Mahal. And they want to go there and they want to explore it and get one of those classic photos, you know, the one where you stand at the gates and got it in the background. So they decided one day they'll go for a trundle down to the Taj Mahal. And they were walking around and they got to the gates at the start and they're like, this is our moment, we're going to grab the photo. And so my mate's mum and dad, they get there shoulder to shoulder, and his mum grabs this guy walking past and says, can you take a photo, and hands him the camera. She's like, do you know your way around? Is this okay? He goes, I think I can handle it. It should be okay. Then she starts giving him some instructions, like make sure we're in the bottom corner and I want it framed up like this, and describing how she wanted the photos. And the guy goes on to take a couple of photos, then politely says, I hope that's okay, smiles and walks away. My mate's mum looks at the photos and she's like, man, these are amazing. These came up so good. Like, I can't believe how good these look. He did such a great job. To which the dad's standing there shaking his head. And he goes, do you know who that was? That was Steven Spielberg you're trying to instruct on how to take a photo. Over the last few weeks, we've been observing how an encounter with Jesus can change everything. In the first week, Andrew was sharing about how when we encounter different people and have experiences, it can change our perspectives, change our impressions. We looked at how as a church, our approach with refugees and homelessness has changed as we've interacted with the Korean community and through Winter Shelter. But on top of that, an encounter with Jesus changes everything. Last week, we held a bit of a mirror up to our world at the moment and had a look at the landscape that we're seeing with the questioning of the traditional structures and authorities that we once had, yet how an encounter with Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life can change everything. But the reality is, sometimes we have encounters in our life where we just seem to miss what's happening, don't we? Where they have little impact. Like if we have an experience we have experiences in our lives that in the end just turn out to be a really nice story, a really cool story, like having Spielberg take a photo of you and trying to explain to him how to take a photo. Yet an actual encounter, when we have an encounter, it shouldn't leave us in that place that we're in. It should change who we are and where we're going because of that encounter. From that point forward, our lives should be different because an encounter will change everything. But then there's another group of people, final group of people who have an encounter, have an experience, it changes the trajectory of their life. And this group can look back on this experience and see how their life has changed. They can see the impact of it. But it can feel like it happened so long ago that it feels slightly removed from today. Yeah, my life has changed, it's different. I wouldn't be where I am right now if I hadn't had that experience. But it doesn't enter into daily dialogue with who I am. I wonder if you can picture any experiences like this for yourself. Maybe you moved somewhere new and you're not living in that same house, but changing locations changed your life. Maybe you met someone, had a friendship, but you don't see them much anymore, but they had a massive impact. Maybe you had a career change that opened up doors, but you're not in that job anymore. Life can look different. The experience back then changed and has impacted who I am today. But I don't interact with that much. Do you think that our encounters with Jesus can end up like this as well? Do you think we can encounter Jesus and make an impact and it changes our lives, but it's something that happened back then? It isn't impacting me today. Like Jesus is someone that we encountered years ago. But today, I live in the moment and I'm living a very different life to what I was, but I'm not having that encounter today. We're going to look at such an encounter in the book of Matthew today, in chapter 20, from verse 20 to 28. And if you've got your Bibles, I invite you to open them. They'll be up on the screen. And here we see that the mother of the sons of Zebedee came up to Jesus with her sons. And kneeling before him, she said to Jesus, and wanted to ask him something. And Jesus said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Say these two sons of mine are to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." Jesus answered, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm to drink?" And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right and at my left is not mine to grant, but for those whom has been prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard it, they were indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus called them all together and he said, "You know the rulers of the Gentiles lord over them, and the great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever will be great among you must be your servant, and whoever will be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Let's unpack this story a little bit together this morning. What we see here is Jesus. He's just been doing 3 years' worth of ministry. He's been moving up and down between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee, which is the northern part of the West Bank for us today, and just north of that as well. And as he would go along serving and ministering, great crowds would gather around him. They'd listen to the things he had to say, whether it was in the countryside or by the water where he'd be in a boat. He would also talk in synagogues or churches. But these people who would come to him, they would be expecting to see a miracle as well, not just to hear his teaching. They'll bring their sick and their injured, and they'll appeal to Jesus to heal or impact them. And as Jesus was journeying along, ministering in these ways, he didn't go alone. He called 12 men to follow him, to walk in his ways and to live out his teachings. These men were his disciples. There was also a larger crowd who followed him around and supported him and journeyed alongside him. But for these 12, they knew Jesus and Jesus knew them. James and John were two of these men. In fact, they were two of the first ones called to follow Jesus. And we can read about this encounter they had back in Matthew 4, where they were working for their father and they were working as fishermen and cleaning and repairing their nets. And Jesus called out and said, "Come follow me." And with this, they dropped what they were doing, joined Jesus, and everything changed. Yet while this encounter with Jesus changed the direction of their lives, there were still areas in their lives that needed to have an encounter with Jesus. There were still things about them that needed to be confronted. And we can see this at the start of this passage we're looking at in verse 20 to 22, where James and John's mother approaches Jesus and asks if they can sit in a position on the right and the left hand, the most trusted positions next to Jesus, those who are in closest proximity to him, to have the highest level of recognition. And even after having an encounter with Jesus, after journeying with him, after seeing everything he's done, there's this deep longing inside of them to be in a place of honor, for validation, for recognition. And it still plagued their hearts, their minds, and their lives. Their whole worldview had become distorted because they still longed for this desire. You see, just having an encounter with Jesus and experiencing him doesn't mean that every aspect of your life will be changed, that everything is now perfect, that life is blissful. For example, only a chapter earlier we can see in Matthew a young man who encounters Jesus. And this happens in chapter 4, and it says, as Jesus was setting out on a journey, a man ran up to and knelt before him and asked, "Good teacher, what is it that I must do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, and honor your father and mother. And he said to Jesus, Teacher, all of these I've kept from my youth. Then Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, You lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. And the young man, disheartened by the saying, went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. For this man, you can see that having an encounter with Jesus, he's had that encounter. He's trying to live for God. He's trying to fulfill the commandments. But even after this encounter, with Jesus, he refuses to fully follow him and have a transformed life. Why? Because there is this desire in his heart, this desire that left him feeling disheartened, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. He desired affluence. He desired wealth over following God. For James and John, that desire that was in their hearts was for honor. They wanted to be seen as someone significant. And I spent a bit of time thinking about this and wondering, as we look at our culture today, what is the underlying desire that we have? If we stop for a moment now, I invite you to stop and think, what are the deep desires that our culture longs for, that we buy into? Yes, we do desire popularity. We desire affluence. We desire to be seen as someone who is significant or to be youthful. But some of the common phrases that I have seen and heard that encapsulate what I believe is the desires of our culture are these. Follow your heart. Follow your heart. Be who you want to be. If you feel it, then pursue it. Because if you feel it, then that is really what must be real. And if I had to distill these down into one simple statement, it would be, feed your appetite. Our culture is built upon this desire to say, feed your appetite. Whatever you long for, whatever you hunger for, it's our job to feed that, to fulfill that. We tell our kids that they can grow up and be whoever they want to be. Dream about it, pursue it. Every door is open to you. All our advertising based on TV is about fulfilling desires, isn't it? We think about the ads that we see, the script that's being sold us. Buy this product, have this experience, and you will get what you desire. After the last 2 years, probably the most common statement I've heard is I need to get back to what is real and authentic. I need to go and find myself. I need to fulfill who I am. I need to be true to myself. And then even as a church, we're like, I don't like that song, or I don't like it done that way, or I prefer it if we did this. And if you don't do this, then I'm just going to go find a new community that meets my desires and my needs. I need them to be met by you. Feed your appetite. You know, throughout Christian faith and the communication through Jesus and the Bible, it actually spends a lot of time talking about following your heart and desires. So much of this conversation is built upon feeding your appetite, following your heart, and fulfilling your desires. Did you know that? A lot of the Bible, a lot of Jesus talks about that. It does do this, but it doesn't elevate it as something that should be strived for, something that we should long for. The Bible talks about it, Jesus talks about it, Christian faith talks about it, but when they talk about it, they call it sin. A falling short of what God has planned for us. A falling short of the God-given potential to us, and a replacement of what God says is best for us with what we think is good for ourselves, what we long for ourselves. Feed your appetite is referred to as sin. A falling short of being who God made us to be. A falling short of our relationship with God when we replace God as the thing we're striving for, the one we're striving for, with our appetites and desires. Falling short with our relationship with each other as I put myself first and this is what I feel and what I desire, and it fractures our relationships as I elevate myself above the person next to me. And we can see that playing out in verse 23 and 24. When Jesus says to James and John that these seats are not mine to give. You're trying to force God's hand by saying you know what's best. You desire something more than what God is preparing. And when the other disciples heard about this, they became indignant. They became angry, annoyed, frustrated with James and John, who were trying to elevate themselves above them. See, when we go about following our heart, following the desires that are in us, often it creates an opportunity for sin to present itself, to express itself. And we know this. I'm sure all of us have experienced this, that the feeding of our appetites doesn't always lead to godly outcomes. When Jesus calls us, he calls us to follow him another way, to deny ourselves, to suppress our desires, and to live a life of love and a life of sacrifice and follow him. Logically, we know this is true. We know that following our desires isn't helpful. That for a functioning society to work, for a community to work well together, it takes each of us to suppress what we want to do for the sake of others. For example, all of us could leave here today, jump in our car and do 120 kilometres an hour down the back streets through Croydon, couldn't we? Feel like driving fast, I could go and do it. But we don't do that. We choose to suppress that urge and that desire to drive fast, and we follow the speed limits. Why? Because we want to love people. We want to sacrifice what we want for others, suppress our desires, because we don't want to go flying around a corner and run into someone crossing the road. We could do whatever we want, but we choose to follow a better life, a life of love, and a life of sacrifice to follow Jesus. If everyone did what they wanted, we'll quickly spiral down into a state of dystopia. Our world will fall apart. It'll be a world of chaos. We know this in the big things, and we know it in the little things. We know for kids that they love eating sugar, right? They love lollies, they love ice cream, and they would eat it all the time if they could. But we deny them doing that. We suppress that desire because it's better in the big picture. If they're going to grow up healthy, they need a healthy diet. And throughout history, we've seen this play out as well, that every successful society knows this. That when we look out for our own tribe alone, when we look out for those with us, we can't build a large functioning society. But to have a functioning society, we need to suppress our instinctive desires as our small group for the sake of others. This is the foundation that all societies have been built on. And it's only when societies grow to such a point that they become too big for their own means that they fall. It's when a leader desires more power and then it topples the empire. Or the societal values move to pursuing my desires more than the others, and moral decay sets in and disorder sets in and the society topples. We can see this when a community chooses to suppress its natural desires. It's the only way that the community thrives. We see it also in history in some of the historical writers and stuff. But Shakespeare has a poem that he released in 1601. It's a short course that he releases on the social, moral, and spiritual disorder that he was witnessing at his time. I'm going to throw it up on the screen. It goes like this. It's a little bit of old language. It says, "Take but a degree away, untune the string, and hark what discord follows. Then everything includes itself in power. Power to will, and will to appetite. And appetite, a universal wolf. So doubly second that with will and power, that it makes perforce a universal prey, and at last eat up himself." What Shakespeare is saying in this is that the coming together of power, will, and appetite forms this wolf, this elite predator that devours everything around it. And if we look around at our world today, as we look at what we looked at last week, we can see that our society structures are being eaten up. They're being eaten up by this wolf. Be it universities, laws, technology, family systems, arts, media, and churches. But having done so, this wolf comes to a point where it needs to start turning on itself. It's devoured everything else and it starts eating itself. And if we think about where we find ourselves today and look at some of the cultural scripts we've got, people in our societies are going, is there anything of value left fighting for in our world? Is there anything of value left fighting for in Western democracy? Is there anything left fighting for that is of value that I can hold on to? And we start to question our society, our world, and our faith in Jesus. It's a dark road that we go down when we stop living a life of love and a life of sacrifice and replace it with just chasing our own desires. And many of us have experienced that, haven't we? Been on the receiving end of that. When people turn on us, when we turn on each other. We know how it feels when people only think of themselves. When they leave us out and they don't think about us. When someone's in a busy Christmas period and they park and you can't get your car into the car park next to it because they've taken too much space. We know how that feels, right? When they think of themselves. When someone takes praise for the work that you've done at your job, they claim the credit for themselves. When they leave the mess on the floor and Megan says to me, I need to pick that up again. Come on, you can just put it in the basket. When you think of yourselves and fill your own appetite. We know what it feels like. We experience this when we look at a kid in a supermarket and they're cracking it because they want that lollipop and the mum says no and then they start crying and screaming and the mum gets so embarrassed they give them the lollipop and we go, that's not going to be good for the kid in the long run because you've just reinforced they can have whatever they desire. We look at it as we see with countries around the world where there's a conflict in Ukraine and in Burma for the last 75 years when the leaders don't deny themselves for the benefit of others. And they follow their own heart's desires and rain injustice and terror on other people. It's truly a dark road that we go down when we stop living a life of love and sacrifice and replace that with fulfilling our own desires. See, this is why the Bible so frequently talks about chasing our heart and our desires as sin, fulfilling our own appetite. While many of us have been sold this narrative in our society today that we need to look after our heart, be gentle with our heart, be sensitive to our desires, understand them and fulfill them, it's also sobering to remember that our hearts and our appetites can deceive us. They can lead us to a place that God doesn't desire us to go, to see ourselves short of our potential of what God's made us for. Throughout the Bible, we can see scriptures such as in Jeremiah that reminds us that our heart is deceitful above all things. It's desperately sick. Who can understand it? Or Paul in the New Testament in Romans reminding us that for those who live according to the flesh, set their minds on the things of the flesh, on their own desires. But those who live according to the Spirit, set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set your mind on the flesh is death, but to set your mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. But those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Or in Galatians where it says, I say to you, walk in the Spirit and do not gratify the desires of your flesh. Do not feed your appetite, for the desires of the flesh are against that of the Spirit, and the Spirit against that of the flesh. For these oppose each other and keep you from doing the things that you want to do. Essentially, this is what Jesus is calling James and John to, calling each of us to live a life of love, a life of sacrifice. He's saying that the leaders in our world, as we look around them, they're in places of honor. They're doing the things that they want to do, but they lord over us. They lord over those who are under them. And if you want to be great, if you want to follow Jesus, it comes through denying of yourself. Whatever that desire is that keeps you from following him, whether it's a desire for honor or for affluence or fulfilling your appetite, deny that and live a life of love, of service for others. For Jesus came here not to be served, but to serve. You see, just because we've had an encounter with Jesus and we're walking with him, whether it's for 5 minutes, for 5 years, or for 5 decades, there are still areas of our lives that need to encounter Jesus, aren't there? Maybe it's one of these that we've mentioned today. Maybe for you it's something else. But what would allow you to encounter Jesus in that place? You see, Jesus didn't just say these things, he lived it, he showed it. His way is a way of humility, of denying yourself, a way of love, a way of sacrifice. It wasn't long after Jesus said this to James and John that he called his disciples together for their final time of sharing a meal before the events of Easter. And it was here that he laid aside his outer garments, taking a towel and tied it around his waist, and poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel that was around him. And when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garment, he resumed his place at the table. And he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If then your Lord and teacher has washed your feet, you also ought to wash the feet of one another. For I've given you an example that you should do just as I've done to you." You see, for us, Jesus is calling us as his followers to live a life of love, a life of sacrifice, to humble ourselves, deny our appetites, and serve each other, serve others. And why? Because an encounter with Jesus changes everything. It takes us from a place of living for ourselves to living a life to the full that we can find him in. A life to the full, a life of love, a life of sacrifice. So I just want to take a moment as we conclude our time together today and invite you guys to close your eyes for a few minutes. I've just got a couple of questions that I invite us to think through. What marks your life at the moment? Is your life marked by following Jesus or chasing your own appetite and desires? What marks your life? I invite you to track that thought forward for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And if you chase that path that you're looking down, where do you end up? What path are you on? With your eyes closed, I invite you to imagine what it would look like if each of us had an encounter with Jesus. If we lived a life of love and sacrifice. Imagine what it would look like if you looked to your left. Who's there next to you? Who's encountered Jesus through you? What communities are behind them that have had the ripple effects of encountering Jesus through your life of love and sacrifice? As you look to the right, how different does Maroondah look? How different does Maroondah look as it's now encountered Jesus through a life of love and sacrifice shown through you, through us as a community? And as we prepare to approach Easter this week, where we see that Jesus didn't just come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, we know that this starts with an encounter. It starts today with an encounter. And if there are desires or paths that we're chasing, today I want to invite you to turn from those. To turn back to Jesus and to follow his life of love, his life of sacrifice. So we can turn around today. As Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many, to set us free. We're going to pray in just a moment, but with our eyes closed, if there are things in your life, I'm going to ask you guys actually to acknowledge those, and I'm going to invite you to put your hand to Jesus and say, I want to turn from these things today and come to you. So if there are things in your life where you're filling your own appetites and you want to turn, I invite you to put your hand up. I'm going to pray together for these things. Father, I thank you for everyone here, for the opportunity that you've called us to experience your life of love through your sacrifice. Where you've loved us so deeply that you do not leave us where we are, but you stepped into our world to change us, and you call us to come and acknowledge you. Father, I pray for everyone here, for those that have raised their hands, that you would meet them, that there'll be an encounter in those spaces and they would be able to feel and see and acknowledge your love. That shame will be replaced by love and guilt replaced by love, and there'll be a warm embrace from you and from the community around as we orient our lives towards you. Father, I pray for us all as we prepare to encounter you this week at the cross, that we would take the opportunities presented over this week to allow others to encounter you through our lives. Pray that all of our lives will be marked by an encounter for you, that we can live for you and acknowledge you every day, and to see you moving in us, through us, and around us, changing us, changing those we know, changing the world that we live in. Father, be glorified today. Pray for everyone here that we'll be able to meet you and acknowledge you. In Jesus' name.